Silara held her two children close as the icy wind howled across the barren wasteland. The sky above was a dull shade of gray, and the twin suns of this forsaken planet had already begun to set. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the hopelessness creeping into her heart. She had once been a noble of the Avari people, a race known for their grace and intelligence. Now she was nothing, the banished woman, a mother with no home. Her youngest, Celis, whimpered softly, "Mother, I'm hungry." Silara's throat tightened. They had not eaten in 2 days. She pulled her tattered cloak around them, shielding her children from the biting wind. "I know, my love," she whispered, "just a little longer." Her people had abandoned her. They had cast her out for breaking one of their most sacred laws, falling in love with someone outside the noble bloodline. Her mate, their father, had died trying to protect them. And now she was alone, left to wander the desolate outskirts of a lawless world, hoping to find shelter before nightfall. The ground beneath them was rough, filled with jagged rocks and patches of frozen soil. There was no sign of life, only the distant ruins of an old colony, half buried in the dust. Silara took a deep breath. That ruin was their only chance. If they could find even a broken structure to hide in, they might survive the night. Holding Celis in one arm and guiding her older child, Dryan, with the other, she pushed forward. As they approached the ruins, a rusted metal sign hung loosely on what remained of a wall. The letters were faded, but she could still read them. Human Research Outpost. Abandoned. Humans. She had never met one in person. The Avari had always spoken of them with a mixture of caution and respect. Unpredictable. Dangerous. Resilient. Silara didn't know if any were still here, but right now she didn't care. If there was shelter inside, she would take the risk. She stepped over the wreckage and entered what used to be a corridor. Dust and debris covered the floor, and the walls were cracked. But it was better than the open wasteland. "We'll rest here," she told her children. Dryan hesitated. "What if something lies here?" Silara scanned the shadows. "Then we'll deal with it. Together." She found a corner and helped the children sit. Celis curled up against her, exhausted, while Dryan remained awake, his eyes darting around. Silara stroked his hair. "Sleep, my son. I will keep watch." But she was weaker than she admitted. Hunger, exhaustion, and cold gnawed at her body. She fought to stay awake, but her eyelids grew heavy. Then, footsteps. Silara's eyes snapped open. Someone was here. She reached for the small, dull blade she had hidden in her cloak and pulled her children closer. The footsteps were slow, cautious. Then, a shadow appeared at the entrance of the corridor, a tall figure, covered in a thick coat, with a metal device in his hand. A human. Silara's breath caught in her throat. The stories of humans flashed in her mind. They were powerful, quick to act, and not to be underestimated. The man studied her and her children for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and lowered the device. "You look half dead," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Come with me." Silara tightened her grip on the knife. "Why?" The human shrugged. "Because if you stay here, you'll die." His words were blunt, but she knew he was right. She glanced down at Celis, who was barely awake, and Dryan, who was trying to be brave, but was clearly terrified. This human, he could be a threat, but he was also offering a chance. And right now, that was all she had. Taking a deep breath, Silara made her choice. She followed the human into the darkness, hoping she hadn't just walked into a new nightmare. Silara followed the human through the ruins, her heart pounding with every step. Her grip tightened around Celis, who was barely awake, while Dryan stayed close to her side. The human moved ahead of them, his posture relaxed, but his steps careful, as if he was making sure they were not being followed. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. The stories about humans always painted them as unpredictable, capable of great kindness, but also dangerous when provoked. And yet here she was, walking deeper into the unknown with one. After a few minutes, the human stopped in front of what looked like a heavy metal door built into the rock. He pressed a button on a small device, and with a hiss, the door slid open, revealing a dimly lit space inside. "Get in," he said, stepping aside. Scifi hesitated. "Why are you helping us?" The human sighed. "You don't have to trust me. But out there, you won't last the night. Inside, at least you'll be warm and safe." She glanced at her children. Celis was shivering, and Dryan's lips were dry from thirst. She had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the doorway. The room was small but surprisingly clean. A few lights flickered overhead, and in one corner there was an old but working heater. Various tools and machines lined the walls, and a metal table stood in the center. It was clear this human had been living here for some time. The human closed the door behind them and set his weapon on the table. "You can sit," he said, nodding toward the small cot in the corner. Scifi guided her children to the cot, where Celis curled up immediately, too exhausted to care. Dryan sat beside her, his eyes never leaving the human. "You have food?" Scifi asked. The human walked over to a metal storage box and pulled out a few ration packs. Not much, but better than nothing. He tossed one to her. She caught it and hesitated. Was this a trick? But when she opened the packet and saw the food inside, all doubts disappeared. She tore off a piece and gave it to her children first. Dryan ate quickly, while Celis, still weak, took small bites. Scifi finally allowed herself a taste. It was dry and tasteless, but it filled her empty stomach. The human watched in silence, leaning against the table. "So, what's your story?" Scifi stiffened. "It doesn't matter." He raised an eyebrow. "It does if I just risked my supplies on you." She met his gaze, debating whether to speak. Finally, she whispered, "I was cast out. My people, they abandoned me and my children." The human nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Yeah, I figured." Scifi frowned. "How?" "You're wearing noble clothes, even if they're torn, and you don't belong on a wasteland like this." She was surprised by his observation. He was more perceptive than she expected. "And what about you?" she asked. "Why are you here, living alone?" The human exhaled, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "Name's David," he said. "I was an engineer for a colony outpost a few years back. When the colony shut down, everyone left. I didn't." "Why?" He smirked. "Because I had nowhere else to go." Scifi studied him. A human, alone on a dying world, surviving with nothing but his own skills. Maybe humans and Ev-Eri were not so different after all. Suddenly, a beeping noise filled the room. David turned toward a small screen on the wall. His expression darkened. "What is it?" Scifi asked, sensing his tension. "Trouble." He pointed at the screen, where a red light blinked. "Motion sensors. Someone's out there." Scifi's body tensed. "My people." David shook his head. "Doubt it. More likely slavers or scavengers." Fear gripped Scifi. If slavers found her and her children, there would be no mercy. David grabbed his weapon from the table and checked its charge. "Stay here. Keep the kids quiet." Scifi grabbed his arm before he could move. "Wait. You're going out there." David nodded. "If they're looking for us, better to deal with them before they get too close." Scifi hesitated. She didn't know this human, didn't trust him completely. But right now, he was the only protection she had. "Be careful," she whispered. David gave her a small, reassuring nod. Then, without another word, he slipped out the door, disappearing into the darkness. Scifi held her children close, her heart pounding. The human had saved them once. But would he survive what was coming next? Scifi sat still, holding her children close as the heavy door shut behind David. The room suddenly felt colder without him. Celis had finally drifted into sleep, his small body curled up against her, while Dryan sat alert, watching the door with wide, frightened eyes. "Will he come back?" Dryan whispered. Celara placed a hand on his head. "I don't know," she admitted. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the distant echoes of footsteps. Celara's heart pounded. She wished she had a weapon, anything to protect her children if something went wrong. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The silence in the room was unbearable. Then, suddenly, a loud bang. Dryan flinched, and Celis stirred but did not wake. Celara pressed her back against the wall, every muscle tense. More noises followed. Heavy footsteps, muffled voices, and then a sharp crack of what sounded like a weapon firing. She clenched her fists. Was David fighting? Was he hurt? The footsteps outside grew louder. And then, silence. Celara barely dared to breathe. Then, the door's locking mechanism beeped, and with a slow hiss, the metal door slid open. Celara's heart nearly stopped. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. The dim light from inside illuminated his face. David. He stepped inside, his clothes slightly dusty, his gun still in his hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Celara exhaled in relief. "You're alive." "Yeah," he said, sealing the door behind him. "But we have a problem." Celara frowned. "What happened out there?" David walked over to the table and set his weapon down. "3 men," he said. "Scavengers. They weren't looking for you, at least not yet. But they were searching the area." Celara swallowed hard. "Did they see you?" David shook his head. "No, but they found my traps. It won't take them long to figure out someone's living here." Celara tightened her grip on Dryan's hand. "Then we must leave." David looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And go where?" Celara opened her mouth but stopped. She had no answer. There was nowhere to go. David sighed. "Look, I don't like this either. But moving in the dark, with 2 kids, on a planet crawling with scavengers and slavers, that's suicide." Celara hesitated, but she knew he was right. "Then what do we do?" David ran a hand through his hair, thinking. "We wait. They'll search the area tomorrow. If they find nothing, they'll move on. But if they don't," he glanced at his weapon, "then I deal with them." Celara felt a shiver run down her spine. This human was willing to fight for them, people he barely knew. "Why?" she whispered. David looked at her. "Why what? Why are you helping us? You could have ignored us. Let us die out there. But you didn't." For a moment, David didn't answer. Then he sat down on the metal crate, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I know what it's like to be abandoned," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to have no one." Celara stared at him. There was a pain in his voice she hadn't expected. "You lost someone," she guessed. David's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he admitted. "A long time ago." Silence filled the room. Celara glanced at her children. Celis was still asleep, and Dryan, though awake, was beginning to doze off. She looked back at David. "Thank you," she said softly. David nodded but said nothing. The room remained quiet except for the distant hum of the heater. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, and somewhere far off, the scavengers lurked in the darkness. Tomorrow would be dangerous. But for now, they were safe. Celara sat awake, listening to the quiet hum of the heater. The night outside was restless. The wind howled, and distant sounds of metal creaking echoed through the ruins. But it was not the wind that kept her on edge. It was the fear of what came next. David sat across from her, checking his weapon with careful hands. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the door now and then, as if expecting trouble at any moment. Dryan had fallen asleep beside his younger brother, Celis. Their soft breaths were the only peaceful thing in the room. "You should sleep," David said, his voice low. Celara shook her head. I can't. David sighed, placing his gun aside. Tomorrow is going to be tough. If they come looking, I need you to be strong. Celara looked at him. I am strong, she said firmly. David held her gaze for a moment before nodding. Yeah, I can see that. Silence stretched between them. It was a strange kind of silence, one that carried both tension and understanding. Then, suddenly, a sound, a distant clank, metal against metal. Celara froze. Did you hear that? She whispered. David grabbed his gun and stood up, his movements smooth and controlled. Yeah, he said. Stay here. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against it. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, another sound. This time, closer. Celara's heart pounded. They're coming. David turned to her, his voice firm. Wake the kids. Get ready to move. Celara quickly shook Dryan and Celis awake. Stay quiet, she whispered to them. We might have to leave. Dryan rubbed his eyes, confused. What's happening? Shay. Celara hushed him gently. Just stay close to me. David opened a small panel on the side wall, revealing a narrow tunnel. This leads to an old storage area. If things go bad, you take the kids and run. Celara hesitated. And you? David smirked slightly. I'll buy you time. Celara didn't like that answer. But before she could argue, a loud crash shook the walls. David moved fast, shutting off the heater to make the room colder. He then grabbed a piece of old equipment and tossed it against the far wall. What are you doing? Celara whispered. Making them think this place is empty, David murmured back. Footsteps approached. Heavy boots against the floor. Shadows passed under the door. Someone muttered in a rough voice. Might be nothing. Just wind. Another voice responded. Check it anyway. Celara held her breath, pulling her children close. Celis buried his face into her side, and Dryan clenched her sleeve tightly. The door handle rattled. David gripped his weapon, fingers steady on the trigger. A long pause. Then the footsteps moved away. Celara exhaled shakily, but David stayed tense, listening. A few minutes passed before he whispered, They're gone. For now. Celara swallowed hard. Will they come back? David nodded. Probably. And next time, they won't leave so easily. She looked at her children, fear tightening her chest. Then we have to go before that happens. David sighed, rubbing his jaw. Yeah. At first light, we move. Celara knew the journey ahead would be dangerous, but staying here meant death. As she held her children close, she made a silent promise. No matter what happens, she would keep them safe. Tomorrow, they would leave, and she prayed they would survive. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the metal walls, casting long shadows across the cold floor. Celara tightened the blanket around Celis, who still slept soundly. Dryan, however, was wide awake, his small fingers gripping the edge of her sleeve. David stood by the door, his weapon slung over his shoulder. He had barely rested, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of their small hiding place. It's time, he said quietly. Celara took a deep breath and nodded. Where do we go? David knelt by the tunnel entrance he had shown her the night before. This leads to the lower levels of the ruins. Fewer patrols there. Once we're out, we head south, away from the scavenger territory. Dryan looked up, his voice small. Is it safe? David hesitated before answering. Safer than staying here. Celara gently shook Celis awake. We have to go, little one, she whispered. Celis blinked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. Go where? Somewhere better, Celara said, forcing a smile. David pulled open the tunnel's metal cover. A damp, musty smell drifted out, and the darkness inside seemed endless. Celara hesitated. The unknown was terrifying, but staying here was worse. David climbed in first, testing the ground below. It's stable. Come on. Silara lifted Celis into the tunnel, then helped Dryan down before climbing in herself. The walls were rough and cold against her fingers as she crawled through. David moved ahead, his small flashlight casting a dim glow. The tunnel stretched far, twisting and turning beneath the ruins. Water dripped from above, and the air was heavy with dust. Celis coughed. "It stinks," he complained in a whisper. David glanced back. Better than getting caught. Silara reached out, squeezing Celis's hand. "Just a little longer, my love." Minutes passed like hours as they crawled forward. Then, suddenly, David stopped. He held up a hand. "Voices," he whispered. Silara's heart pounded. She listened closely. They weren't alone. Muffled voices echoed through the tunnels, the sound of boots scraping against metal. David motioned for them to stay quiet. He pressed against the side of the tunnel, slowly peering around the next bend. Silara held her breath. Celis clung to her, trembling. David returned, his expression serious. Two men, blocking the way out. Silara swallowed hard. "Can we turn back?" David shook his head. "They'll find the exit we used. We have to go forward." Silara felt fear grip her, but she nodded. "What do we do?" David checked his weapon. "I'll distract them. You take the kids and run when I say." Silara's eyes widened. "No, you can't." David gave her a firm look. "I promised I'd get you out. Trust me." Silara's chest tightened, but she had no choice. David took a deep breath, then moved forward. A second later, a loud crash. The voices ahead shouted in alarm. David fired a shot at the tunnel ceiling, sending dust and debris falling. "Now," he yelled. Silara grabbed Celis and Dryan and ran. The tunnel shook as they moved, boots thundering behind them. "Stop them," the voice roared. Silara pushed forward, her lungs burning. She could see the end of the tunnel, light spilling in from the outside world. Almost there. Then, a hand grabbed her arm. She gasped, spinning around. A scavenger, his face covered by a mask, yanked her back. Dryan screamed, "Let go of my mother." Silara struggled, but the man was strong. Then, a gunshot. The scavenger's grip loosened, his body falling back. David stood behind him, gun smoking. "Go." Silara didn't hesitate. She grabbed her children and ran into the light. Fresh air hit her face as they burst out of the tunnel and into the ruins beyond. The sun was rising, painting the sky in gold and red. David ran up beside them, breathing hard. "Keep moving." Silara nodded. They had escaped the tunnel. But the real danger had only just begun. The cold morning air hit Silara's face as she and her children ran through the ruins. Broken buildings stood like silent giants around them, their cracked walls hiding shadows that could be friends or enemies. David ran ahead, scanning the area for danger. His grip on the weapon was firm, his eyes sharp. Behind them, the angry shouts of scavengers echoed through the tunnel they had just escaped. "They're coming," David said, his voice tight. "We need to move faster." Silara's legs burned, but she held Celis in her arms, while Dryan ran beside her, his small hand gripping her sleeve. "Where do we go?" she asked between breaths. David pointed to a narrow path between two collapsed buildings. "That way. It leads to an old road. If we reach it, we might find shelter." Silara nodded, pushing forward. The ground was rough, littered with broken stone and metal scraps. Celis whimpered, burying his face in her shoulder. "It's okay, little one," she whispered. A gunshot rang out. The sound was distant, but it made her heart pound harder. "They're getting closer," Dryan said, his voice shaking. David looked back, his jaw tight. "We can't outrun them forever. We need a plan." They reached the edge of the ruins, where the land opened into dry, rocky terrain. A rusted vehicle lay on its side, half buried in dirt. A broken highway stretched out ahead, leading into the hills. David scanned the horizon. There's an old outpost a few miles from here. If we make it, we can hide. Lara hesitated. Will we be safe there? David exhaled. For a while. Before she could answer, another gunshot cracked through the air, much closer. Go, David shouted. They ran. The scavengers had reached the ruins behind them. Lara risked a glance back and saw dark figures moving between the broken buildings. Dryan tripped. Lara gasped, grabbing his arm before he hit the ground. Are you hurt? Dryan shook his head, but his face was pale. David fired a shot over his shoulder. Keep going. Lara held Dryan's hand tighter, forcing her tired legs to move. The sound of boots pounding against the ground grew louder. A bullet hit the dirt near David's feet. He cursed. They're trying to slow us down. Silas whimpered. Lara's arms ached from carrying him, but she refused to let go. Then, a loud roar filled the air. Not human. The scavengers stopped. David's eyes widened. That's not good. A shadow moved in the distance, large and fast. Then Lara saw it, a massive creature covered in thick, scaled skin. Its yellow eyes glowed in the morning light, its sharp claws digging into the earth. It had smelled them. The scavengers hesitated. The creature let out another roar. David grabbed Lara's wrist. Now's our chance. Move. The group ran toward the hills, while the scavengers stood frozen, deciding whether to chase or retreat. The beast turned toward them. One of the scavengers fired. The bullet hit the creature's thick hide, barely leaving a scratch. Bad choice. The beast charged. Screams filled the air as the creature attacked. Scavengers scattered. Some ran, others fired useless shots. One man was too slow. The beast grabbed him, tossing him like a rag doll. Lara forced herself to keep running, not looking back. Dryan's breaths were fast, but he kept up. Celis clung to her tightly. David led them into a narrow path between the hills. The ground was uneven, but they pushed forward. Only when the screams faded did they stop to catch their breath. David leaned against a rock, wiping sweat from his forehead. We got lucky. Lara collapsed to her knees, holding Celis close. Are they gone? David listened for a moment. The only sounds were the wind and distant animal calls. For now, he said, but we can't stay here. Lara nodded, exhausted but determined. They had survived another day. But the journey wasn't over yet. The wind howled through the rocky hills as David, Lara, and the children pressed forward. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. Their legs ached, their breaths were heavy, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. David scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of danger or hope. There, he pointed. In the distance, half hidden among the hills, was an old outpost. Its metal walls were rusted, and parts of the structure had collapsed, but it was still standing. Lara's heart lifted. Will it be safe? It's our best chance, David said. With renewed determination, they moved faster. Celis whimpered in Lara's arms, tired and hungry. Dryan clung to his mother's side, his small body trembling from exhaustion. As they reached the entrance, David pushed open the heavy door. It creaked loudly, but no immediate danger greeted them inside. Dust covered the floor, and broken equipment lay scattered. But the structure was intact. David checked the corners, his weapon ready. No signs of recent activity. We might have this place to ourselves. Lara let out a shaky breath. Finally, she gently set Celis down. He curled up on the floor, too tired to move. Dryan sat beside him, rubbing his little brother's back. David secured the entrance, then turned to Lara. We should rest, but not too long. We still need food and supplies. She nodded. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind remained alert. They had escaped danger, but survival was still a battle. David rummaged through an old cabinet and pulled out a small ration pack. It's expired but should still be edible. Silara took the pack and broke off small pieces for the children. Dryan ate slowly, his eyes drooping with sleep. Celis barely managed a few bites before dozing off. Silara stroked their hair, her heart aching. They deserve better. David sat beside her. They will get better. She looked at him, eyes filled with unspoken emotions. How do you know? He exhaled, leaning back against the wall. Because I've seen it before. People lose everything, but they find a way to rebuild. Silara's fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. You gave us a chance when no one else would. David gave her a small smile. You're stronger than you think, Silara. You've protected them this far. That's not easy. She lowered her gaze. I thought we were doomed, that no one would care if we lived or died. David's expression darkened. Your people abandoned you. But humans don't turn their backs so easily. Silara blinked, surprised. You're part of my team now, David said firmly. That means I'll fight for you just like I'd fight for anyone else. Something warm spread through Silara's chest. She had spent so long being treated as an outcast, but for the first time in years, she felt safe. Suddenly, Dryan spoke, his voice soft. Will we have a home again? Silara's throat tightened. She glanced at David, unsure how to answer. David reached out, ruffling Dryan's hair. Yeah, kid. We will. Dryan's eyes lit up with hope. The night passed in quiet exhaustion. David took the first watch, while Silara slept near the children, her body curled protectively around them. When morning arrived, David woke her gently. Time to move. She rubbed her eyes. Where? To a better future, he said with a grin. They gathered what little they had and stepped out of the outpost. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Silara and her children were no longer alone. They had found something worth fighting for. A new life.